Right, so I'm going to talk about how we talk about identity and identity assurance, and ask about whether we've been asking the right questions, because confusion is worse than error. If you make a mistake and you recognize that you've made a mistake, you can rectify it, you can learn from your mistake. But if you're confused, you can't recognize that you've made a mistake. And then you can't learn, and so you go round and round in circles. And I think we've been doing that a little bit with our discussions about identity. Calling a dog a cat and wondering why it doesn't behave as we expect it to behave. Andrew Budd said earlier today that there's a big difference between identity and authentication. And how much of the time when we talk about identity, are we actually talking about authentication? And if so, well, what is it identity? So we've come at it from a very different starting point, because we're a community interest company, and at the beginning, we're not really interested in identity at all. We're interested in empowering individuals with their own data. We do this by equipping individuals with their own personal data stores, which enable them to collect, store, manage, share, use their own data under their own control, independently of any organization that may be collecting data about them. So we're coming from it very, very differently. But data sharing has always been a key part of what we enable, because we're able to provide specialist service providers with the data they need to provide the service as a key part of realizing the value of your data. An unavoidable element of this is being able to verify the claims that you make about yourself, proving you are who you say you are. So since we were founded in 2007, identity has been at the heart of what we do. This was recognized by the UK government back in 2011, when from a cast of hundreds, we were one of 5 companies chosen to pioneer the Verify Identity Assurance Program, along with the Post Office, Verizon Experience, and Digital Identity. Eventually, we left Verify, and I'll return to that. But we've continued to be involved in discussions and proposals about identity through our involvement in OIX, T-Scheme, and DCMS, particularly relating to the UK Identity and Attributes Trust Framework. And we've been influential in changing the name of the program from identity to identity and attributes. And that's really the heart of what I'm going to be talking about. Most recently, we've been consulting with the Scottish Government Digital Directorate on how best to enable citizens to access public services, and that work has resulted in the creation of a Scottish Attribute Provider Service. Again, I'll return to that. So here's our conclusion from 15 years of working in this area. We've been asking the wrong questions. We've been framing the agenda in a confusing way. There is no such thing as an identity. Any attempt by anyone, whether it is a state or a commercial actor, to create a single all-purpose identity as a standalone product or service is doomed to fail. Identity is not a thing. It's a spectrum. It starts at a very, very low degree of certainty about whether a person is who they say they are, or whether an organization is who they say they are, and it rises to very high degrees of certainty. Away from abstract philosophizing, in the practical world of getting stuff done, when people seek to assure identities, the question they're really asking is about risk and probability, whether they can be sure enough that this person is who they say they are. And the answer to this sure enough question differs depending on what they're trying to do. So, for example, some pretty low-risk activities could include taking part in an online chat forum where you could be signing in as Mickey Mouse, or spending a tiny amount at a retailer, or returning to that retailer, or opening an account to pay a parking fee, or registering for a newsletter. Some medium risk activities may be booking for a flight or paying for a high-ticket item, applying for a visa, signing up to a mobile phone contract. And higher risk activities may include applying for a government benefit, applying for a mortgage, life insurance, accessing a savings account, setting up a pension, seeking lasting powers of attorney, committing a person to prison. So the key point about this is that each of these situations requires different bundles of data points. Whatever the use case, the details that are needed are always different, which is why, practically, operationally speaking, there is no such thing as an identity. There's only a bundle of data points. There may be multiple different identifiers which help to establish that a person is who they say they are, but they're just the beginning of a much bigger process. They're just the door that needs opening to where the real value lies, that without the other additional details, which may become irrelevant without those details. This isn't a minor detail, it's a major issue. Because when we stop to think about it, what we call identity applies to every step of service delivery, from initial application through onboarding, returning to login, considerations of eligibility, configurations of service provision, actual operation delivery of the service, billing, customer service, associate administration, and so on. As I said, for each step of this journey, different data points are needed. For example, the data needed to log into a service will be different to the data needed to deliver an item, which will be different again to the data needed for a warranty claim. So at each point, the individual needs to be identified, but the cloud of data points surrounding them needs to change. For example, Deloitte's study of the potential economic benefits of digital identity for the UK has case studies relating to the right to work, verifying professional qualifications, checking employment status, conducting background checks for disclosure and barring service, travel authorization and ticketing, and so on. It calculates the potential savings from these case studies as being between 750 and 950 million. But for each of these case studies to work, completely different sets of data need to be shared. It's not actually talking about digital identity at all. Deloitte's was not talking about identity. It was talking about the value of new systems for the sharing of verified attributes. This is what identity is really about: data logistics. Getting exactly the right information to and from the right people and organizations at the right times, which has led us to a simple conclusion. Identity can never be a product which is sold by a product producer, an identity service provider, in a market for identities. Identity assurance is just one part of a process of data sharing needed for service provision. And this process of data sharing, for this process to work, it needs the right infrastructure. Infrastructure that can handle any and all of the data needed by individuals and service providers when seeking to access or provide services. This infrastructure cannot just be about identities, like name, address, biometrics, whatever. It is about any and all the data that can grow up and accumulate around an individual. Data that can build up to be richer and richer over time. So it's about identity that helps people and organizations move through that spectrum of risk, where we go from degrees of uncertainty to increasing degrees of certainty, which raises a further question. Who is identity assurance for? Historically, the quest for identity assurance has been driven by organizations wanting to check that individuals accessing their services are who they say they are. That's an entirely valid quest. But there's another side to this coin. Identity should be a service to citizens too. Organization-centric priorities around identity, verifying that individuals are who they say they are, have created a completely imbalanced system where virtually no effort has been devoted to helping individuals assure themselves that the organizations they're dealing with are who they say they are, which is why we have such wide-scale system-wide fraud. It was so good to hear that previous discussion there about verifying organizations. Also, when dealing with service providers, individuals continually need to provide credentials which prove details about themselves, to prove themselves eligible for services, to gain access to the services, to configure details of service provision around their particular circumstances, and so on. And when individuals do these things, they don't only need to do them with one organization, they need to do them with probably over 100 different organizations, because that's how many relationships you as an individual have with organizations. So in each case, that what individual service providers do to make their identity assurance processes more efficient ends up creating major hassle, complexity, and difficult for individuals who have to try and manage and deal with all those different systems. So what works well for each service provider in isolation creates a complex, costly mess at the system level, which is what we've got now. Which means that infrastructure that enables individuals to share their data with many different service providers not only helps individuals reduce friction, effort, risk, and cost in their lives, it also does the same for service providers. This was, at least in part, the goal of various attempts to create assured identities in the past, such as the Verify program. But instead of seeing identity assurance as a data logistics challenge, these programs tried to create a market. And that market has actually just been compounding the complexity. It didn't solve the problem, it compounded the confusion. And this is what the problem, like I said, I think that's happened with programs like Verify. So what have we been doing? Over the past 15 years, we have built a live operational data logistics infrastructure that enables identity assurance as a byproduct of data sharing for the purposes of accessing, using, and promoting services. Infrastructure that is citizen empowering, neutral, enabling, and cost-cutting for all concerned, including at system level. Here's how it works. Organizations holding data about individuals provide them with copies of this data, verifying details about them via a cryptographically secured token that cannot be tampered with. Individuals hold these verified attributes in their personal data store, where they retain control over this data. Each individual holds their own private key to their PDS, which is separately encrypted, thus ensuring their safety, security, and privacy. Individuals can then share these verified attributes with service providers as and when needed. It can be a huge amount of data, what's needed for an important decision relating to, say, finances or health, or it could be a tiny amount of data, just one data point, simply verifying a detail as a next step in a user journey. It doesn't matter. What matters is that exactly the right information is passing to and from the right people and organizations at the right time. As I said, this is in theory, it's now actual, live, operational, and it's being adopted by Digital Identity Scotland with its planned Scottish Attribute Provider Service. Here's a few details from its roadmap. They're a bit difficult to read, so I'll just break them down into a few of their sections. Phase 1 addresses the basics, such as ensuring safe, simple, single sign-on to all government services. Phase 2 is about equipping citizens with their own attribute or personal data store. And here, these are the reasons for doing so, that citizens can store information for reuse in later applications, Data can be used in the same or different relying parties, and citizen journeys become quicker and simpler. Phase 3 then leverages the ability of a rich array of verified attributes to deliver identity assurance as a service to citizens, turning identity into a byproduct of better data sharing. Finally, phase 4 crystallizes the value of this data logistics infrastructure for service providers, relying parties, by providing them access to much richer, more accurate data at a much lower cost. Will it all turn out as planned? I don't know. This is one thing I've learned over the years, is that even with the most brilliant strategies, there's many a slip between cup and lip, so we'll have to see. But what I do know is that the logic and potential of this approach has been recognized and is now gaining traction. So I'll finish there. To summarize, if you ask the wrong questions, you get the wrong answers. The industry has been asking the wrong questions about identity for a long time. The issue is about how to share verified attributes. It's about data logistics. Identity is not a product and never will be. It's not a specific package made up of a combination of pre-specified components that is sold to users of this product, i.e. organizations. It is a byproduct of data logistics processes where the right information flows to and from the right people and organizations at the right times, that don't only narrowly specify a task of identity assurance, but where which powers every step of service provision. Identity does not constitute a market made up of separate identity service providers competing to sell identities as products. We don't need identity service providers if identities can be assured as a byproduct of the sharing of verified attributes. And what we're talking about here is not a market, but an enabling infrastructure. What we call identity service providers today are, in fact, specialist suppliers of verified attributes. And they need the infrastructure for data sharing for their value to be truly realized. And identity will never become a goldmine of a market generating constant high levels of profit for market leaders. Quite the opposite. Like all infrastructure, such as roads, railways, electricity, and internet, everyone, all round, benefits the most when the costs of providing and accelerating this infrastructure are brought to as close as zero as possible. This is about cost out, not margin plus. There are huge opportunities for new value creation in identity, but they don't lie where most people have been looking for them. Once we start asking the right questions, these opportunities in citizen empowerment, verified attributes, neutral enabling data logistics infrastructure, and reductions in friction, effort, risk, and cost will become more and more apparent. In our view, the central question we have to answer is this: how do we enable individuals in their various roles as citizens, customers, members, etc., to access and share the information they need to get stuff done in their lives, including proving claims and credentials about themselves? This question has two key aspects: identity and data as a service to the citizen, not just to the organization; identity as a byproduct of the service, just one part of the much bigger central issue of the creation and sharing of verified attributes. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Alan. That was a beautifully argued monologue, and some really interesting points in there. And there's a few things I want to ask you before I ask the audience to come in. You mentioned, I think it was a figure of up to 950 million, you said, in savings. Where will those savings come from? Can you be a bit more specific?
In the Deloitte study, they're virtually all to do with reductions in friction, in cost of verifying information, and in reductions in fraud.
Right, okay. From any particular verticals that would benefit, or?
Well, they went through, I mean, the whole study was based on a number of different verticals, as I mentioned, of course, disclosure and barring service, travel, ticketing, employment, and so on.
So your central argument is that there's no market in identity per se. This is about suppliers of verified attributes, okay? And you did mention a personal data store at one point. So again, people will probably work out what my line of questioning is and the tropes that I use, but what does that look like in real life? How does the average customer who's not interested in this stuff, isn't techie, how do they acquire a personal data store and start to share attributes with brands they trust?
There's two different things there, but the key process by which we're operating, and there's many people operating in this space, and they're using different models, but the key process by which we're operating is that the organization invites an individual to set up a personal data store. So it's led actually by an organization providing a service. And so, for example, we're working with Macmillan Cancer on helping people manage their cancer journeys. So when you get cancer, in a UK city, you could end up dealing with over 200 different organizations. We're not just talking about the medical provisions, the multiple medical services, but also all the issues that affect your life, your finances, your employment, where you live, how somebody, will somebody walk my dog when I can't, when I'm, too ill, and so on. And so what we're doing is we're enabling the personal data store, which is being provisioned by Macmillan Cancer, to take on all these attributes and for individuals to share little bundles of those data with chosen people as and when they need to get something done. So the really interesting thing about that is that it takes an enormous amount of stress out of the individual's life, but it's also massively reducing the costs of Macmillan Cancer link workers who are trying to organize and orchestrate the person as they go through these multiple journeys. So another example we're working on is we're working on a project called Peoplehood, and that is to do with helping people live longer, more healthily where they currently live. And that's been provisioned by the Housing Association. The Housing Association invites people to open up their personal data store, and the data is fed into their PDS for the provision of the multiple services relating to medical, finance, health, and so on.
Would you, a personal data store can be an app, can it be a web page?
This goes back to the Andrew Budd's discussion earlier on. Our PDSs are stored in the cloud because we don't believe that they should be device dependent. And they're mostly accessed via a web app. So that it's like using your banking app. You access the data on your mobile phone. The mobile for the web app is linked to the PDS. So the data is uploaded to the web app, and any data that's generated in the process goes back to the web.
And so how do the verified attributes get into that store?
So we create links, API links with organizations, and organizations then download the data. So, for example, one of the big sort of things that we're looking at the moment is with the current issues with energy, lots of people are going to be facing real problems.
Yeah.
And one of the ways of really, really streamlining attempts to access help is to have verification from organizations such as DWP that you're on a certain benefit or whatever. A verified token, a simple piece of information that really helps somebody else go to get the support that they need.
So you talked about Macmillan. You talked about, it's interesting to hear you explain it, that you think that people in need of a certain service or in need of help in some way, the organization that they turn to might be the one to actually suggest this route to them.
Yeah.
Do you think that will these, if a person has multiple relationships with multiple companies, will that mean that they end up with multiple personal data stores, or is there a way of aggregating more than one?
That's the entire point, that the individual becomes the point at which data about themselves is integrated. So in the chart that I showed, the data is coming in from many, many different organizations. That all goes into the individual's personal data store, where they have their own picture of their own lives. And then they can share chosen bits of that data with service providers as and when needed.
And so how progressed are you with this vision?
Well, it's built, and what we found is that historically, the private sector went like this to it. The last thing they want to do is to share data with their customers because it's theirs, and they want to make money from it. But what we have found is that in the public and third sectors, there is a really growing interest, because there's often very many organizations who all are serving the same individual, but in one aspect of their lives. And by enabling the data to be shared and to be integrated about the individual, we're providing better services at lower cost. But Tim, the issue, we're talking about the PDS idea here. I came to talk about identity, but the key point that I was making is that identity is just a byproduct of the ability to share verified attributes. And what our society needs is the infrastructure that enables us to share the verified attributes.
No, I realise that, but I think it's just interesting to hear about practical applications of these arguments. Because we have had a lot of discussion today about the sort of nature of identity and what it is, so that's why I wanted to nail down onto that. So we've got about 3 minutes left. Do we have any questions? Lee's got a question for us. Good.
Thanks, Alan. For this data logistics model to really flourish, we need some powerful network effects to occur, such that we can realise all those utility benefits. The telecoms industry has been quite amazing at developing a network effect to connect 7 billion people on the planet. Is there anything to learn from the way telecoms has gone about doing that?
I think the issue with the telecom industry is that it's not shared data with individuals. And so I'm sure there's a huge amount to learn from the network effects. But the process of sharing data with individuals and enabling the individual to become the point of integration and control of that data, I think that's the next step.
Any more questions?
Yeah, maybe later. Oh, before Tim, I'll ask mine then. Question from the public out there. I'll try to rephrase. You're talking about relationships with individuals. What happens when we've heard about cars, when it's things that are there, and individuals have multiple relationships but not equal relationship with these? Does it make sense?
I think there might be two different questions there. One is about Internet of Things, and the same principles apply, which is that actually in our work with peoplehood, a lot of the work has been done with smart data, smart hubs, home hubs, and the data is coming out of the smart home hubs and going into the PDS and feeding the PDS. So the Internet of Things, the same principles apply. With power relationships, basically what we're saying is that individuals should be in control of their own data, and that this is not only an ethical thing about privacy and data protection, it's actually economically incredibly makes sense because it cuts costs so much.
And lots of other positive comments from the speech. So that's it from the...
Okay, so Tim, do you still want to answer your question?
Yeah, Tim Ward from XConnect. Very loud microphone. One question I have about this is dealing with complexity. I mean, one of the biggest problems is you may end up with tens of thousands of attributes just for an individual person. I mean, I struggle enough remembering 3 attributes. But in then giving the individual the responsibility or the control for sharing those attributes, How do you simplify that? I just wonder, I mean, it's possibly a very long answer, but I wonder if there have been any particular experiences of how you kind of simplify that down and make it doable for an ordinary person.
The key thing, I think, is that every information-driven service is no different to a physical product. It is a combination of components. And each service requires its own specific set of components to get a job done. And each service provider knows exactly what those specific components are. So each service provider says to an individual, I need this, 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 and this to get the job done. And then what we have built is mechanisms such as data sharing agreements and so on and so forth, which help protect the individual and make sure that the service is only asking for the data that is necessary for the provision of that particular service, which goes back to the core principles of GDPR. So the complexity lies in the combination of those data points to create a service, and that is the job of service providers. Their job is to make it absolutely clear to the individual what data is needed.
Okay. Makes sense.
Great, good. Well, thank you so much. Thought-provoking stuff. Alan, thank you again. And I think we need now to bring back Michael and Dario.